Now this session is going to be a little less formal. Lonnie's going to be leading this session for us again. And we're going to let Lonnie start the subject however we want, but we want to encourage participation. Anybody has any questions? I think Noah will give out some cards maybe for some of y'all, or if you want to speak up at any time when we get to that section appropriately, we'll encourage participation. It's your opportunity to ask the questions that you want. And we can all, don't think that your question is not important. Everybody has important questions. That question you ask may be the one person sitting next to you wants to know the answer to. So please encourage you to ask the questions when we can. Lonnie, would you like to take control?
Now, let me start out with some just fundamentals of Bible study that might or might not help you while you think about questions you'd like to ask. And I do maintain the right to go, I'll have to defer on that. But when you think about studying your Bible, learning how, especially the English Bible, how it's organized will help you somewhat. Think of the New Testament in these terms. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John ask and answer the question, who is Jesus, and what does it mean to follow him? So you've got four different perspectives. Matthew from a Jewish perspective, Mark from a Roman perspective, Luke from a Gentile perspective, and then John takes just a real different deviation and isolates on faith as his topic. So once you get through the Gospels, you get to the book of Acts. The title Acts always bothered me. In Greek, it looks like the word practices. So the actions of the apostles. What did the guys that Jesus taught do after he left? So you read the book of Acts with the idea, this is who Jesus was, and after he left, this is what his followers did. Now, once you start reading the book of Acts, you're going to run into people, Timothy and Titus. You're going to run into places, Colossae, Galatia, Thessalonica, Corinth. And then the rest of the New Testament are letters that were written back to churches or individuals to help them mature in their Christianity. That's how it's lined up that way. So when you start reading your Bibles, think of it in terms as this comes from an apostle who's telling a young church how to solve a problem. And if you can ever figure out, number one, the problem they're trying to solve, and number two, the attitude of Christ that they use to solve the problem, that's known as task theology. And that's the way I've kind of adopted learning to study, what are the facts, what was going on, who was he writing to, why, what are the concepts. This is the nature of Christ that they're using to solve the problem. How can I do what they did in Corinth at my home in order to make it work? And so I really encourage that look at the New Testament. The Old Testament, Genesis to Nehemiah, is the entire Old Testament story. You start at Genesis and you finish Nehemiah, you're done. Everything after Nehemiah fits in on a timeline between Genesis and Nehemiah. So all those prophets fit in with the kings. The wisdom literature fits in before that. And so what you do is, instead of trying to make sense out of the Old Testament prophets, if you put them, read 2 Kings 8 and then read the prophet that goes with it, it'll make much, much more sense to you. And we've unfortunately organized the English Bible by those categories. The other thing is, when you read the Bible, don't say, okay, this year I'm going to read the whole Bible. That's well and good. It's a nice undertaking. But read the same book a dozen times in a month. Sit down and try to read that thing from start. I'm going to read the book of Colossians. And instead of reading 4 verses, it wasn't written with verses. It wasn't written with chapters. It was written like a letter. So you sit down and you read the book of Colossians. Write down the words you don't understand, define them. Read the book of Colossians. Look at the words or the themes that repeat themselves. Write that. Once you've read it 5 or 6 times, and most of the things in the New Testament would fit on about 4 typewritten pages if they weren't divided into columns and have those verse markers. And so read it and then ask yourself, if I were going to write Paul back, what would I write him? And if you can't write him back after you read one of his letters, you don't understand his letter. Does that make sense? You get a text and it's out of context, you don't know what to send back. So I've read what Paul said to the church at Colossae. Dear Paul, thank you for writing about the supremacy of Christ. Thank you for comparing Christ to the elemental principles of the world and showing that he's superior. Thank you for teaching us that we were redeemed and that we had a circumcision made without hands. If you can't write him back to answer his letter, you didn't understand his letter. And sometimes when you read the New Testament letters, pretend you're sitting behind him at the airport and he's talking on his cell phone. Can you hear one end of a cell phone conversation, tell what's going on? Yeah, so you're sitting behind Paul and you hear him write to the church at Corinth. Now, you've written to me about whether it's good for a man to touch a woman. Hey, that's an interesting conversation to have. And listen to what he says, and then you can infer what he's talking about. So I kind of use that to help people understand the way their Bibles are written. Not endorsed by your elders, and they're welcome to unendorse it. Get a translation you can read. There's no perfect translation. Once a man got a hold of it, we made mistakes with it. But if you're not reading at grade level, you can't read your Bible. If you don't understand one word out of every 10, you don't have comprehension. So if you're missing about a tenth of your reading, you don't understand it. In the original Koine Greek, that's a third grade reading level. The King James requires about a 12th grade reading level. New King James, 10th grade. New International Version, about a 9th grade reading level. And if you're reading at grade level, you're fine. But if you're not reading at grade level, then you're reading something that you just do not absolutely have the ability to understand. And if you can't read it, you won't read it. But if you can read it, you will. So parents, encourage your young people to read a Bible they can understand. Now, you get a hold of a translation, and I'm not talking about a paraphrase, I'm talking about an actual translation. But you get a hold of a translation, and you run into something that say, hey, that's a little squirrely. We use the word squirrel on our ropes course. We identify participants as a squirrel or as a not a squirrel. A squirrel are the people that make nuts nervous, okay? So when I say the word squirrely, it's not. So you read a passage and it's a little squirrely. You know, I'm not sure. Number one, you use context. Context is understanding who wrote it, who is writing to, who's speaking, what's being spoken about. For instance, does the Bible say that Jesus was a glutton and a winebibber? Yes. It's in the Bible. Who said it, though? Oh, the Pharisees. So an inspired writer can accurately record words that somebody said, even though those words are inaccurate. Does that make sense? Well, if you don't understand the context, you go, Jesus is a glutton or winebibber. If you understand who's speaking, you won't walk away believing that. So first of all, you figure out what the context is. Second, if context doesn't solve it, there's usually a clear text that solves it. Clear text just simply means that there's somewhere in black and white that you can say, hey, when I read this, I completely understand it. A clear text never defines an obscure text. I mean, a clear text always defines an obscure text. The obscure text doesn't define the clear text. Does that make sense? You know, what does it mean in 1 Peter 3 when it says, by the same Spirit he went and preached to the spirits in prison? I come up with all kind of weird solutions. Book of Hebrews said, is appointed unto man once to die, and after this the judgment. That's a clear text as to what happens after you die. Nobody's going to preach to you in the realm of the dead and let you be converted, have a second chance. So the clear text and then the context, and if those two things fail you, then look at original text. And you've got enough computing power on that little thing right there. You can do more Greek research in 30 minutes than I could do in a month at Harding University's library. And so you just simply type in Matthew 7, what is the Greek word for whatever, and you'll get accurate information. And so you use context, clear text, and original text to kind of figure out what's going on when you're using a translation. Did that generate any questions or comments? You got a card there? You have 3 cards. Pick a card, any card. I will read the green one. Oh my, somebody has tiny little handwriting. Okay, in dealing with authority, how can I explain things or make a point without sounding argumentative or disrespectful? Why do authority figures sometimes assume that they know what you are thinking? I'm going to assume this is an adolescent who's arguing with mom and dad, a teacher, or a coach. Am I correct? Okay. Because you're a teenager, your mind is developing at an astronomical rate. Okay, there's some stuff going on in the teenage mind that is both fascinating and scary. Your brain woke up in adolescence and said, hey, we need to make some connections. Well, what should we need to connect to? Everything! And it just you woke up there, didn't you? All right. So your brain, the adults on this side of the room have 300 billion dendrites, neurological pathways in their brain. If you're below the age of 26 and above the age of 13, you have 3 times that many. You have computing power in your brain that is unbelievable. The only other time your brain develops that fast is when you're 2. A teenager is a 2-year-old who can drive and is obsessed with sex, okay? And so it makes a very delicate combination. So your brain's developed. The other thing that's going on in your brains for the first time in your life, your intellect and your emotion can talk to each other. When you're a little bitty munchkin head, it's just your concrete thinking. But when you get that intellect and your emotions can talk to each other, that makes a real funny soup up there. You can think and upset yourself. You know, you can walk into your room feeling good and think about something and be sad all of a sudden, okay? The other thing that's happening is because of your emotion and your intellect, emotion is so much easier to work with that you like to work with your emotions. Your emotions are not instruction. Your emotions are information. They tell you something. They don't tell you to do anything. Now, you've got that soup going on in your mind, and then right here in the very back of your brain is the amygdala. Your amygdala is your threat assessor. And your threat assessor causes you, it's bigger right now than it'll ever be in the rest of your life, and eventually it'll shrink down to normal size. So as a teenager, a lot of things you perceive as being threatening. If I don't have the right shirt, I'm at threat. If I don't have one that matches the youth group, I'm at threat. If I don't have a tennis shoe on it, I'm at threat. If I don't have an iPhone 37, I'm at threat. And so everything is seen as a threat. How do you respond to threat? With confrontation. So when an authority figure says, don't do this, you do that, my political views are this, you unconsciously respond with confrontation. Okay? And when you respond with confrontation, you start a normal human process, an unhealthy normal human process. 70% of all marital problems are unsolvable. I'll say that again. 70% of all marital problems are unsolvable. We solve problems in therapy not by dealing with the problems, but by dealing with the interactions of the problems. Number one, we try to eliminate contempt. Contempt is where when you talk to someone, they feel like they've been attacked. So you think about when you're dealing with authority and they get defensive. Authority always feels defensive when they feel like you've attacked them first. Now, as a teenager, you don't realize what you sound like when you go, whatever, and I can't roll my eyes. You know, a girl can see the prefrontal cortex of her brain when she rolls her eyes. I can't do that. When you look at one of your buddies and go, yeah, go for it. That sounds cool against 2 guys. A kid tells me to go for it. I start thinking of the ways I can break his neck, okay? And there's 4. But, and so what you don't understand is in your normal interaction with adults, they perceive contempt. Well, when you perceive contempt or they perceive contempt, you get defensive. Now, defensiveness is where you start that zero-sum game. Now, a zero-sum game means if I win, you lose. If I'm right, you're wrong. If I'm happy, you're sad. So once you trigger in an adult, and by the way, anything other than absolute compliance registers to an adult as defiance. And it doesn't matter what it is. That's the way adults process information. As a teenager, you want time to do it. You want to do it in your own way. You want to freeze your game. You want to wait till it's maybe 14 degrees cooler to take the trash out, whatever. And so when mom and dad say to do something, you say, wait, I don't want to. Why can't I? It's innocuous in your mind. In their mind, it's seen as a confrontation. Because it's a confrontation, they enter into defensiveness. Defensiveness puts you in a competition mindset. I'm right, you're wrong. I win, you lose. I'm happy, you're sad. When you get in that mindset of I'm right, you're wrong, I'm happy, you're sad, your bottom line, baseline functioning is selfishness. Now, you don't realize that. But as a teenager, most of your decisions are egocentric. You're wired to be selfish because you're becoming self-aware. It's not a sin to be a teenager, and that level of selfishness is not wrong. Do you know how you measure trust? Trust is measured, and most people don't know this. Trust is measured by a perception of selfishness. And if I think you're selfish, I don't trust you. I don't get in a car with people I think are selfish. I don't ride in a boat with people I think are selfish. I don't climb rocks with people I think are selfish. I won't go through a door with somebody I think is selfish. When you are acting selfish in actions or attitudes, you're subliminally broadcasting to that authority figure, hey, don't trust me. Hey, don't trust me. Hey, don't trust me. I want a Mercedes and stay out till 1 o'clock. That's selfishness. You think it's a reasonable request. So you set up that dynamic so that when you're talking with authority figures and an authority figure decides, well, let me tell you how it is, they do not feel like you're listening to them. And so they're going to deal with you with confrontation. Now, as a teenager, once you feel like you're not being listened to, you're done with it anyway. How many times have you asked your parent, are you done? Not, are we done? Are you done? I was done 10 minutes ago. I'm asking you, are you finally done? Okay? So what has to happen, instead of you saying, understand me, and the authority figure saying, no, 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 understand me. No, 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 understand me. No, 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 understand. That's a competition. You've got to take the initiative with an authority figure and say, let me make sure I understand what you're saying. You're not trying to prove your point. You're not trying to get your way. You're demonstrating to them that you clearly understand their perspective. And when you do that, you are no longer challenging them from a confrontation perspective, and they'll listen to you. But until they perceive that they've been listened to, all authority figures will argue with you and feel like you are being rebellious. And it's just the way they're wired. A police officer, and I'm not a cop, but I work with cops and I teach at the academy. If when I'm training cadets and I'm the felon, I do felony vehicle stops, and I'm the guy they pull out of the car and they have to get me back and get me in custody. If they'll let me get away with not obeying them on anything little, I'll take advantage of that young officer. I'll disarm him. I'll shoot him with a paint gun. If he says, put your hands in the air, and I do this, and he lets me get away with it, when I walk back there to him and he tells me to turn around, my hands are level with his gun. It belongs to me, and he does not yet know it. If he lets me get away with it. So when you don't immediately comply with an adult, they feel threatened. When people feel threatened, they move into aggression mode. So when whatever it is you're arguing about with an authority, hey, you have to be in tonight at 10 o'clock. Mom, I understand that you've cut an hour and a half off my curfew. Why do I need to be in at 10 o'clock? Because I said so. Yes, ma'am. You're not going to win that anyway. So just say yes. Now, if it's about something else, politics or whatever, you demonstrate understanding. You let them tell you, and you be able to repeat it back to them. Oh, I understand that you don't want me to go to that event because you don't think it's safe, and you don't trust my friends. But if you say it in a sarcastic way, they're going to ramp up and be defensive again. So once you demonstrate understanding to an adult, most adults, when they're not threatened, can have a very good, peaceful conversation with you. Okay? Did I misunderstand the question? If you're brave enough to raise your hand and tell me that. That when you don't obey an adult immediately feels threatened and feels like non-compliance is defiance. Okay? So that's that. Why is it so hard to be consistent in the Christian life as a teenager? some of it has to do with just the idea of your emotions. Paul warns Timothy, don't let anybody despise your youth, but be an example of the believers in word and spirit and conversations, faith and purity. Well, when you think about that list, that's what Paul is telling is our struggle as young people. Now, Timothy was probably 30, but it's a good idea. And consistency in teenage life is a lot of times that as a teenager you feel inconsistent because as teenagers, because of the way your brain works, you do all or nothing thinking. Is anybody here familiar with a continuum? The space-time continuum? Okay, no, we won't get all tricky on you. A continuum is, what's the best food you can put in your mouth? What's the worst food you can put in your mouth? Okay, everything that's not Krispy Kreme donuts is not broccoli. In fact, there's Krispy Kreme donuts, and then there's pizza, and there's French fries, and there's that little lemonade shake they make at Chick-fil-A, and then there's Chick-fil-A itself, and then there's the Chinese buffet, everything on the Chinese buffet, and then there's bratwurst, and onions, and broccoli, and roadkill armadillo. So there's a big continuum, right? In teenagers, you tend to view your self-worth, your ability, and your Christianity in all or nothing terms. See, in my world, that wall is ideal. That wall's unacceptable. That wall is Krispy Kreme donuts. That wall is broccoli. And everything in the middle is my smorgasbord. As a teenager, you divide ideal and unacceptable just like that. If I didn't do it all, I didn't do any. If everybody's not happy, nobody's happy. If I don't have this boyfriend, I'll never have a boyfriend again. And you look at your sports that way, you look at your grades that way, you look at your popularity that way. If mom and dad didn't buy me that, they've never bought me anything. Well, if I can't have that iPhone, I just don't want a phone at all. You treat yourself the same way with God. You go, if I'm not perfect, I'm lost. If I'm not 100%, God doesn't love me at all. Newsflash, there's nothing you can do to make God love you more. And there's nothing you can do to make God love you less. God loved us in Romans chapter 5. While we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. You didn't earn God's love. You can't earn it. He gave it to you. Your behavior, your consistency has nothing to do with how much God loves you, but it's indicative of whether or not you love God. And so quit trying to be perfect. Learn to be consistent and faithful. And I think your word consistent here, you really said consistent, but you meant perfect. It's okay to be imperfect. That's why you have a Savior. Okay? And so when you start thinking in terms of consistency, identify what your inconsistencies are. Identify your mistakes. We call it deep practice. Deep practice is not where you get out on the field and do the thing you're comfortable in. Deep practice is when you do the thing that you can't do very well and learn what your mistakes are. Well, look at where you're failing to be consistent. Is it language? Is it attitude? Is it some kind of habit? And you look at where you're failing, and where you're failing, identify something that you need to work on. Does that make sense? But as teenagers, we try to play to our strengths. Every one of you go to school with that guy who's got 32-inch arms and can bench press 1,100 pounds, but he looks like he's riding a killdeer. Why? He doesn't train his legs. Well, he'll never be a good athlete till he's got overall body fitness. Well, we do the same thing as teenage Christians. I'm really, really good at Bible study, but I'm not good at prayer. I'm really, really good at prayer. I'm not good at Bible study. I'm really, really good when I'm around my Christian friends, but there's something going on when I'm with my non-Christian friends. Well, I analyze that. What am I trying to get? Am I trying to get their approval? Am I trying to make sure they're comfortable with me? You got to become comfortable with the fact that sometimes people are uncomfortable with you because you're a Christian, and you just have to embrace that. Okay? Did I answer that good enough, or do you need more clarification on that? Was that okay? All right. What do you think is a major problem that young people face today? Selfishness. James chapter 1, verse 13. When you are tempted, No one should say, I'm being tempted by God, because God cannot be tempted, nor does he tempt anyone with evil. But each of us is tempted when we are drawn away by our own desires. Old King James Version says lust. Lust does not have a sexual connotation there. It's a want. You're tempted by what you want. James 3:16 compared to John 3:16, where you have selfish ambition, selfishness. Every evil thing exists. The common denominator behind all sin is selfishness. And if you can eliminate selfishness, you can almost make yourself temptation proof. Because when salvation comes down to this issue, not my will but your will. And if God looks at us and goes, not my will but your will, we're lost. If we look at God and say, not my will but your will, we're saved. And if we can eliminate selfishness, it makes us immune to temptation. Because my sin, whatever it is the personal manifestation of selfishness in my life. And your sin is the personal manifestation of selfishness in your life. That's why all sin is the same in God's eyes. You know, I used to struggle with that. You know, how can a guy who steals a candy bar from Walmart be the same as a guy who's out here axe murdering children? Well, they both do what's based in selfishness. So one sin is no different than the other because they're both the manifestation of selfishness. The most serious problem that teenagers deal with is selfishness. God is less than concerned about your happiness. God wants your sanctification. Now, God has provided some things that we can enjoy life. God has given us blessings that we can enjoy life. But if it comes down to will you be happy or submissive, God will take submissive over happy every single time. And understanding that sometimes we superimpose, well, if I'm a Christian, I'm supposed to be happy. No. If you're a Christian, you get to go to heaven. And the few minutes we spend here on this planet really don't matter in the grand scheme of things. And so I think we get selfish, and because we get selfish, we think, hey, you know, I have the right to be with who I want to be with. I have the right to do what I want to do. And if God really loved me, he'd let me. No, God's already on record loving you. He sent Jesus to die for us when we didn't have a prayer. And so if I have to live single, if I get cancer, or my house burns down, I can't be mad at God about that. God's on record to how much he loves me. And so I think the biggest thing that young people face is getting a handle on selfishness. Because once you get a handle on selfishness, you're spiritually mature. Look at the fruit of the Spirit. How do you measure spiritual maturity? Love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and the ability to control the self. And once you have self-control, you're spiritually mature, because then your wants and your desires line up with God's wants and God's desires. In flying an airplane and in rock climbing, you have two factors that predict death: internal hazards and external hazards. When an internal hazard has an intersection with an external hazard, boom, you get a dead pilot or a dead climber. Spiritually, the things that you want, the things that draw you away and entice you, James chapter 1, internal hazards, and then the ability to fulfill those temptations, external hazards. And sin, when it is full grown, brings forth death. And so the internal hazard that all of us deal with, even as adults, is selfishness. And if I could get a handle on selfishness, I could solve all problems in the world, not just the teenage problems. But I think that's the biggest thing. Secondary to that, your generation is uncomfortable with absolute truth. It's really okay to say God's real and evolution's false. It's really okay in a polite way to say Allah is not a God. In a polite way, it's easy to say there's only one Lord and one Messiah, and if you don't believe in him, you're lost. But your generation has been taught tolerance, and then you don't need to be arrogant about it. You don't need to be rude about it, but you need to have a confidence that says, you know, the simple fact that you're uncomfortable with my truth doesn't make my truth false. Okay? And, well, but everybody says the world was flat. You could cure people by draining blood out of them. There's going to be an ice age. There's going to be global warming. And Hillary's going to be president. They haven't been right yet, people. So quit getting sucked into what everybody says. Because I can give you a list as long as my leg, although that's not a very long list, I admit. But I can give you a list of all the things everybody knew that just didn't happen. And so quit being apologetic for having an objective, absolute truth. There's nothing wrong with that. And I'm afraid sometimes that we want to be so tolerant that we compromise our values. Paul says in 1 Corinthians, in view of the present immorality. Okay, what's immorality? Doing stuff that's not right sexually, right? In view of the present immorality, every man should have a wife, and every wife should have a husband. Those are the only two options Paul gave for dealing with sexual immorality. Heterosexual sexual expression, period, end of line. It's not that Paul didn't have any ink. It's not that Paul ran out of parchment. It's not that his audience didn't know about homosexuality. He's writing to the city of Corinth. They knew it. Wow. They didn't invent it, but they perfected it. Okay? And Paul says, here's your options if you want to deal with sexual immorality. You've got celibacy. It's good for a man not to touch a woman. Husband has a wife. Wife has a husband. He doesn't talk about alternative lifestyles. He doesn't talk about anything else. And it's okay to simply say, God designed us that way. Now, when people have same-sex attraction, it goes back to trauma. Okay? And your brain is designed to protect you from trauma. All your behavior is adaptive. And things that are similar gets processed as the same. So if I get stung by a hornet, I'll dodge a housefly, right? If something is enjoyable to me or gets locked in, I'll superimpose that into lots of things. So when you have a student or a child who's prematurely sexualized, early exposure to porn, male-to-male sexual abuse, or early sexual activity that they weren't ready for, that gets wired into their unconscious meanings, their implicit meanings, and they adopt those behaviors as adults. And learning that your friends don't understand that mechanism. Oh, I was just born this way. No, you really weren't. Things that happen in your life cause you to manifest this. We got little bitty guys in here? Not very. You talk to a straight guy, a guy who's heterosexual, and I'm being a little candid, okay? But you walk up to your average guy and say, hey, have you noticed there are girls on the planet? They go, oh yeah, I've noticed there are girls in there. What part of the girl is your favorite part? And they'll tell you. And there's a shopping list, okay? You go, when did you start liking that? They'll go, I've always liked that. No, you didn't. There's a time in your life when you thought a girl had cooties, and you wouldn't hold hands with her. Well, when did you start? Well, I can't remember when I started liking thighs or belly buttons or whatever. Something in your sexual development caused you to say, hey, I like that. And it happened on such an unconscious level, you can't tell me when it happened. A person who's attracted to the same sex had something like that happen to them on an unconscious level that they can't really explain. They think, I've always felt that way. A lot of guys who are attracted to guys have a dad that they don't get their approval from, and in seeking the approval of males, they start idolizing males, and then they trade affection for approval. And if you walk a person down through his sexual history, you can find out those links and those connections. So it's okay for you to go, no, nobody's born gay. There's no such thing as a gay gene. You have monozygotic twins. Where's our twins? Are they monozygotics? Pardon? Identical, okay. So you got a zygote, and it gets fertilized, and then it becomes a clone of itself. One zygote twins. So you have one zygote that splits and makes two people. Those people are genetic copies of each other, okay. In Joseph Nicolaisi's study on monozygotic twins, he said if one twin is gay, the other twin would have to be what? Gay if it's genetic, because they got the same genetics. Was not proven in that study. You have a monozygotic set of twins, one's gay, one's straight. Boom. There's no such thing as genetic. So be comfortable challenging folks' reality in a pleasant, scientific, well-informed way. That just doesn't work. Okay? And I know that sometimes we come off as being intolerant. Speaking the truth in love is what Ephesians 4 says. Okay? And transgender, the transgender community has taken gender dysphoria and they've used as their stalking horse intersex people. Those are people with a genetic condition where their X or Y chromosome did not receive the hormonal inputs that they were supposed to, and genetically their body has not developed like it's supposed to. An intersex person is a medical condition, and it's real. A transgender person is using that medical condition to masquerade behind. Okay? And you've got the right to pretend you're a girl, but I don't have to pretend you're one if you have outdoor plumbing. Okay? And there's a way to say that and to be firm, kind, and compassionate without saying, I got to rewrite the Bible to make you feel comfortable with something that you're uncomfortable with. And it's really not my problem. Now, do they need to be treated kindly? Yes. Do they need to be treated with compassion? Yes. But your generation has got to learn to be able to say, you know, there's some rights and there's some wrongs. And if you can't have objective truth, you can't prove anything. I've got to do a wellness study at my wife's school for her insurance. Are you familiar with the body mass index? A body mass index compares your weight and your height. Well, that's a lose-lose situation for me, people. I'm just telling you right now. You know, according to my height, I should weigh 149 pounds. The last time I saw 149 pounds on a sign going to Memphis, all right? I mean, so this year when I go for the weight screening, I'm going to say, well, I identify as 5'11". I just feel 5'11". That'll make my numbers change. My insurance rates will go low. No, you're 5'4", you moron. You can prove it. Well, there's some things you can objectively prove about sexuality. Don't be afraid to say, well, you know, the facts are this. And I think your generation is going to struggle with being truthful and being called intolerant just because you're truthful. Don't be ashamed of your truth. Don't be arrogant with your truth, but be firm in your truth. Does that make sense? All right, those are my 3 questions. Have we generated any more? Yes, sir. How does what change? I think you quit kneeling to it. You know, you quit letting them dictate the agenda. You start saying, you know, they don't lower the basketball goal. If you can't run a sub-5 40, you can't play in the NFL. If you can't dunk, you can't play in the NBA. They're not going to change those things. So why have I got to change these other things? There's some objective truth in our society that we won't play with. If I don't have the money, they won't let me have a car, I promise you. Well, you're being intolerant. I identify as a rich person. I feel tax-free, but I'm not, okay? And I think you've got to play their game with them. You've got to simply say, okay, if this is true, then it's true across the board. And then you find, and some of you are going to have to become lawyers and fight those cases in court. So you're going to have to become that lawyer that says, you know, I'm going to challenge this on a fundamental level. If a woman has the right to do anything she wants to with her body, then where does the rights of the fetus come in? And the fetus is a person or it's not a person, let's pick one. But there's laws that conflict on our books, and we need some good Christian lawyers who have the time and energy to fight that kind of stuff. And I think you start a grassroots movement. I don't think you have to hide in the corners. I don't think you have to be standing out, you know, marching in front of the abortion clinic either. I think there's a mid-level range, and I think you change it by talking about the truth, not hiding from the truth. The only reason we're in the mess we're in is because people have been allowed to talk freely without being challenged. And our folks who are brave enough to challenge them, some of them have personality disorders, and so they come off looking really, really bad. You don't win fights by confrontation. Now, violence, confrontation is not always the answer. Now, when it is the answer, it's the only answer, and there's a time and a place. But these kind of things, they're not held, they're not won by demonstrations, and they're not won by debates. They're won by us modeling a difference in behavior. When the homosexual community recognizes that we love you, but we still think you're sinning. You know, when do we start treating homosexuals different than we treat alcoholics? When we start treating homosexuals different than the 16-year-old who's sleeping with their boyfriend. It's all sin, but we've camped out on this is the sin the church has to hate. Well, as I understand it, all sin will send you to hell. All sin crucified Jesus. But when we have one category and we're inconsistent with how we treat all sinners, we've got special categories. And that's why they're able to abuse us, because we're inconsistent in our approach to how we deal with sinful people. Did I answer your question? Okay. Anybody else? Yes, sir.
How do you answer the question of someone who maybe was a Christian, not a Christian, or if God is such a loving God, why would He let all this bad things happen? Why does He? How do you? I've had trouble trying to answer that.
I think that's a fundamental flaw in theology, first of all. Romans 8:28, and we know that all things work together for good of them that love the Lord and are called according to His purpose. Notice what that says. It doesn't say that everything has a purpose, and it doesn't say that everything is positive. But everything that happens can become useful in our lives. And just because God allows it doesn't mean God wills it. Okay? We started having difficulties on this planet when sin entered it. That's not God's doing, that's sin's doing. And so God's got this thing on a wind-up timer, and when it winds down, all the bad, all the sin, all the cancer, all the tragedy will go away, and we will live with God in a perfect environment. But until that happens, we live in a sin-controlled, sin-dominated world. So why do you blame a God you don't believe in for stuff that's His fault? Okay? Either He's God, and you've got to submit that some of these things happen, or He's not God. And it's called, what they're dabbling in is called moralistic therapeutic deism. It's the belief that if I do what I'm supposed to do, things will work out for me. And that's not true. Look at Hebrews chapter 11. This is real interesting to me when that argument comes up. You're reading about the people of faith in Hebrews chapter 11. Look at verse 32. He's already talked about Moses and Noah and Abraham. And what shall I say more? This is verse 32, Hebrews 11. Time would fail me to tell of Gideon and Barak and Samson and Jephthah and David and Samuel the prophets, who through faith subdued kingdoms, worked righteousness, obtained promises, stopped the mouths of lions, quenched the violence of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, out of weakness were made strong, became valiant in battle, turned to flight the armies of aliens, and women received their dead raised to life again. All those people had faith, right? Next verse. Others were tortured, not accepting deliverance that they might attain a better resurrection. Others had a trial of mockings and scourging and chains and imprisonment. They were stoned, sawn in two, were tempted, slain by the sword, wandered around in sheepskins and goatskins, being destitute, afflicted, and tormented, of whom the world was not worthy. They wandered in deserts, mountains, and caves of the earth. Everybody in this chapter had the same faith. One people's faith stopped lions, stopped fires, chased armies away, had the dead raised. These folks with the same faith were cut in half and stoned and murdered and tortured and imprisoned and lived in caves. Your faith will not affect your circumstances. Your circumstances should not affect your faith. And so when somebody says, hey, I gave up on God because of these adverse circumstances, that says more about them than it does God. And I don't think you can find a chapter in the Bible that doesn't show that people suffer because we live in a sin-filled world. And that's just an intellectually dishonest argument. And so I say, why are you rejecting God because things didn't turn out like you thought they should? Well, at what point did you get to make the decision how things turn out? And I think folks once you have an excuse for why you don't want to be with God, you're not going to be with God. Most people who come to that conclusion have either suffered a terrible, terrible, disappointing tragedy, or they've got a personally held belief that's incompatible with the existence of God. And you'll find one of those two things. I think you'll find that true almost across the board. And people reject God when there's something they want to do and it conflicts with what God says you can do. There's that whole selfishness thing again. But I just take them to Hebrews 11 and say, look at these people, these great people of faith. Good results, bad results, same faith. They didn't give up their faith. They let their faith assurance of a better resurrection. And so if you're camping out by the stuff that's in this world, your value system's wrong anyway. That's the way I approach it. And then when people say, you know, I don't want to believe in God because things aren't fair or things aren't good. Well, if you don't believe in God, you can't talk about fair or good. You can talk about right and wrong. If we're just evolved animals, then survival of the fittest. Why do lions eat gazelles? They're on the menu, okay? And if all we are is evolved animals, and you can't talk about, well, he's bigger than me, and he's stronger than me, and he's got better genetics than me. You're the people who came up with survival of the fittest. You're not fit, don't survive, bye-bye. Now, the minute you want to start talking about right and good and fair, you've got to introduce God into the equation. Otherwise, you're doing this again. And I need one or the other. So you can't blame a God you don't believe in for stuff that he lets happen. And if you believe in God, then you recognize that stuff happens because we live on a planet controlled by physics and a planet dominated by sin. And that's my answer. Anybody else? Going once. If you have cognitive dissonance spiritually, if you're doing this, then something's out of balance in your life. When there's an inconsistency going on with you, that's when you need to make a change. Now, a lot of times, that response does not have to be walking down an aisle. You simply make peace with God, and you apologize to the people you've sinned with or against, and it's done. If you walk in the light as he is in the light, the blood of his Son continually cleanses us from every sin. You don't have to have me pray for you to be forgiven. You don't have to have an elder pray for you to be forgiven. If you're a child of God, you ask your Father to forgive you, and he'll forgive you. Now, if you'd like the church to be aware of your struggle, and they can be praying for you to have strength not to repeat that, that's an appropriate thing. But I really don't think you have to come down this aisle to be forgiven. There's a church out southeast of here, and they don't have an invitation. Ever. At the end of their services, their elders go to the back of the foyer, and they say, okay, at the end of our services, if you've got a spiritual need or something going on, see one of our elders, and they'll take you into a room and handle it. And then the next service, they get together and they say, hey, Susie last week came and asked me to pray for her about this, this, and this. And we handled it, and we'd like to pray on her behalf again. And nobody ever walks down the aisle. They walk out the back and grab one of their shepherds. And their shepherds are dealing with people one-on-one or in small groups all the time without it being that big walk of shame thing that we tend to do. And I'm not against the invitation. I just saw that as a much more efficient way. And, so if you have some unfinished business with somebody or with God, it needs a response. It can be a public response or a private response. But if you have unfinished business with a neighbor or with God, you need to take care of it. And that may not be an answer sanctioned by your elders. But that's my take on it. I'm wearing the thing. Anybody else? All right, I think we're good. So what's the schedule now? Snacks. All right, so we're going to be dismissed for some snacks. Do you need to call on somebody to pray about those snacks?